Right. Well, good afternoon again. Apologies. Where's the ball? Go and get the ball. You want the ball? Where did you put it? Go and fetch it. It's David Willey here again for the, I've lost count, 14th Tank Museum question and answer session. And I'm here on a fairly windy day. And by the time this video comes out, we'll have reopened the museum. Ticket only, you need to pre-book in advance and look on the website. That's what I was going to say really on that one, is if you're keen to come to the museum, look on the website, all the instructions there. So earlier today I was there busy putting stuff in all the cases. There's still people there getting it all ready for when we do open. And one of the things I'd say as well, we can't open everything. So for example, at the moment, the archive and library won't be opening yet. So we still have staff on furlough, still other issues to deal with. So let's just see how that goes. But if you can make it, look on the website, book your ticket, do come along and we'd be really pleased to see you. And of course, we've got our cracking Second World War exhibition. Pretty much everything's there that you would have expected to see beforehand. So looks stunning and some great stories in there. So again, I'd be interested to see if some of you do make it along, if you give us some feedback on that. And if you haven't seen one of these question and answers before, the gist of it is I answer questions that people have sent in, sometimes via email, sometimes on the comment section that you'll see below this one. And at the same time, I try and flog you things, try and get you to buy some things from our shop, because truth of the matter is that money we're making from the shop is really important to us. We are an independent charity, and we've been obviously being closed, this is one of our few sources of incomes, being able to sell things. So forgive me if it sounds like I'm overdoing it, but I'm encouraging you to buy things, and thank you as ever so much for those people who have bought things. And I know some of you will be getting all excited because we've now got a Mr. Finn look-alike puppet here sitting there, which I'll talk about in a minute. And I've got Finn, Finn's my dog. Finn's here as well, wanting to join in everything, and I have to throw the ball every now and again, working from home and all that. There we are, we understand these things, don't we? So on with the questions. Right, let's start off. Had a number of questions that touch on Lend Lease. One of them was saying, you know, how much did we lose going across the Atlantic in terms of shipping? How many tanks went down, what percentages and things that way. I just thought it was an intro really to that bigger picture of, we hear the word Lend Lease, what does it really mean? And I will try and get rid of the boy for a moment. So the argument about Lend Lease, what goes on with Lend Lease? Roosevelt is sympathetic to the British cause, but America is not in the war, and America in 1939-40, there is still a massive groundswell of opinion that we really don't want to get involved in the Europeans' problem, especially on the Republican side. You know, this really wasn't it. So Roosevelt has problems, especially as there's legislation which bans the sale or the export of certain types of war material. So what he does is, he first of all, they do what they is often described the cash and carry, which is he is sympathetic to the British cause, so he's prepared to allow a British mission to the United States to buy material and place orders for material to be designed to British ends. But that's just not going to be enough. And the other big issue as well for Britain, which is why Lend Lease is so important, is quite simply we run out of money quite quickly. The gold reserves, everything is spent relatively quickly on buying weapons, because in next to no time there is that moment that Britain is the last European power fighting Nazi Germany. Once everyone else gets knocked out, that's it. For a set period of time. So if Britain goes, woof, that's it. That last little island, however you want to look at it, aircraft carrier that's off the European coast, if that goes as well, that's Europe under fascist domination. So what does he do about that? So he passes through Congress a bill that ends up becoming the Lend Lease Act, which allows at a preferential rate war material to be sold or passed on to Allied nations as they are going to be, or in other words, those who Roosevelt is thinking, mainly Britain at this time, is fighting Nazi Germany. And the actual bill is passed in March 1941. It actually, proper Lend Lease finishes in September of 45, and there's a kind of rounding up thing where actually a lot of material, because again, this is the irony with a lot of this material actually, is once it's been passed on, war material is quite often it's not wanted back, even though you like to know where it's gone and everything. So at the end there's a kind of like last payment that rounds off. They don't want to sort of start shipping stuff back across the Atlantic anymore, sort of thing. So Britain ends up getting the last of it that way. But so why is it Lend Lease? Leasing of bases. So in exchange, we end up, Britain says you can use our bases, Newfoundland, which at the time wasn't part of Canada, Bermuda, there's various bases. And in turn, when America later enters the war, obviously all the bases in Britain, and we supply materials also to the US forces as well as part payment for this, but we also take out loans, long-term payback. In fact, the last bill for Lend Lease that Britain paid back to the USA was actually paid on December the 31st, 2006. That was that last bill payment. Now, why Lend Lease is so important to Britain is because once we are in the war, we lose most of our army material in France, or an awful lot of it, after the retreat from Dunkirk. Much of that material is left behind, very little comes back. We concentrate, as we've said before, on building fighters, and we concentrate on building bombers so that again we can get back at Germany. Tanks that are being built in the factories, we say carry on building those, but we have aspirations for other technology, other tanks, other vehicles. But the trouble is we're just running out of capacity and room. So one of the things Britain does in September of 40 is a Tizard mission goes over to the United States, and it's separate from Lend Lease, but you can't help but mix the two things together, because what Britain does is it gives some of its ideas and its best little gadgets that it's coming up with and passes them on in some cases to the US for further development. You know, these are things in embryo. For example, Whittle's jet engine. Other elements are for things to go into further production. So, for example, one of the ones that has been described as one of the most precious cargoes to ever reach American shores was the cavity magnetron, which basically gets used in radar. And the Americans are happy to admit, woof, this was way ahead of what we were developing at the time and where they were in the radar process. There's other things like the proximity fuse, the VT proximity fuse. That sort of technology, again, is being handed over, and some other ideas so that the Americans can take it on and develop it. And this is in essence done for free, but it's passed. You can't help but feel of that Lend Lease deal about the equipment coming the other way. I will throw the ball again. And I'm also just going to, because I always get nervous about this, just check I did turn on the microphone, otherwise I'll be talking to myself. So the terms, by the way, terms of Lend Lease, it's everything has to be used until returned or destroyed. That was the argument in the paperwork as well. And of course, Lend Lease then goes to the Soviet forces. The stuff that comes to Britain, by the way, we then also distribute it to Polish free fighters fighting in Britain, then the Polish First Armoured, Canadian forces that have come from Canada, we distribute there. Other countries get Lend Lease as well, including the Soviet Union. And I just want to give you a couple of facts and figures here. $31.4 billion of Lend Lease aid goes to Britain, 11.3 billion to the USSR for the Red Army, etc. And of that, again, you read different countries' histories and different things are written at different times. Lend Lease was absolutely, and no one in Britain will ever deny this, essential for the continuation of Britain's war effort and allowing Britain, so when we're talking tanks all the time, but it allowed Britain to concentrate and keep concentrating on those planes and bombers and tanks, because when the Americans start producing tanks, M3s, Grant tanks, M4 Shermans, Stuart tanks, etc., that's the sort of thing that then fills that need in Britain, which means we can concentrate elsewhere, and it's only later in the war that we catch up with the tanks again. So that as a little bit of an issue, because again, when we sometimes look at tank design, why things take longer and everything, step back a second, look at the strategic view, look at that bigger view of what's going on in Britain at the time, what its priorities are, why things are going as they are, and the fact that the Americans are coming along with a very serviceable tank. That, I repeat that line from Albert Speer, these tanks are better than ours, when he sees a Sherman. So, you know, really good stuff coming from America. That's why we could concentrate on these other areas, which were much more important to us at the time, i.e. air defence and then bombers for getting back at Germany. I found a figure. So the person who asked the question, you know, how much was lost? Unfortunately, I can't find specifically tank losses that were coming across the Atlantic. But we know that about 7% of shipments going through the Arctic route to the Soviet Union were lost. So there are fairly substantial losses around the place for some of that equipment that's being shipped to Europe. But I come back to, and I've mentioned it in earlier ones, Lend Lease again, remember that idea. Why is the Sherman 30 tons? Because it's going to be shipped all around the world, and there's no point creating these massive super heavy tanks. 30 tons most docksides can deal with. If you're suddenly going 50, 60 ton type vehicles, you're limited to the capacity in some areas and ship space and everything else you can imagine as well. So I just thought that was an interesting one to touch on, because Lend Lease, you hear again, it's another one of those things that's going on in the background. Look also how it's influencing our subject area, tank design, what comes out of the tanks, you know, production numbers, etc. And on the production numbers, I just dug out this figure as well for you. Britain receives 17,184 Sherman tanks from America as part of its Lend Lease deals, as it were. And that's about 78% of Sherman tanks that were made, you know, for Lend Lease. And most of those, well, actually, again, that's another whole subject here. We go through, you know, why Britain changes the names of the Shermans from to Sherman 1, 2, 3, 4, etc. Most of them we end up with the Sherman 5, and we go for that Chrysler A57 multi-bank engine, which means they've got the longer hull, etc. But that's a lot of Shermans when you think about it, and that's just Britain. So, right, I will move on from just talking about Lend Lease. Thank you, all of you commented when I was doing the last question and answer. Planes going over with the twin rotors, V22 Ospreys. Thank you very much for letting us know about those ones. Paul Dark mentions the fact that when we were talking last time, as ever I always forget some of the things on the table in front of me. He said, what were those 3 books that I failed to mention? Thank you for Paul. That gives me an excuse to come back to. These were the 3 books. These are those ones, I have talked about them before, but basically they're the Osprey series, all put together with some new text to join it all up and fill in the story. British battle tanks, so World War I to 1939, written by David Fletcher. British battle tanks again, but this is American-made tanks in World War II, David Fletcher and Steve Zaloga, and then British battle tanks in World War II, and that's just all the British ones, as it were, by David Fletcher there. And I think there's a post-war one as well with Simon Stunson as well. But have a look on our website, as ever. I'm encouraging you, link there. And, you know, as I've said before, when you've got David Fletcher, Steve Zaloga, etc., cracking stuff, and in a single volume, you've got a hell of a lot of information, good photos, good colour schemes for your model makers, etc. So you might want to have a look at those ones. I will throw the ball again, if I can see it. Where's it gone, Finn? Finn, where's it? How can I throw it if you keep it in your mouth? Right, what other questions have we got here? Actually, another one that as well, Ryan Connell, I mentioned in one of the other books I was showing that where we've managed to get hold of some nice, very cheap titles, good books, cheap titles. So, Commandos and Rangers book, sold out, we're getting it back in. So keep an eye on the website. As I've said before, if there's something there you're not too sure about, go back and have a look. We may have been able to restock on that, so do that one. And I gather, and sorry about this, a couple of weekends ago we had a massive problem. Not our problem, I have to say. It was, you know, we're wagging fingers at certain other people, but it was to do with the postage on our system that we're using and everything. If you were put off by the postage, go and have another go and have a look and just see what it was, because we had a bit of a cock up there. So apologies if you were trying to get something and suddenly thought, whoa, I thought, you know, if it was ridiculous expensive. So, you know, do please keep revisiting there. And I will throw the ball one more time. Right, let's carry on. Peter Simonson about Sturm Artillery piping. I've got the book, I should have brought it out. Sturm Artillery, the piping around the jackets, they don't go for it in the way that lots of the other arms do. So careful on that. One or two private purchased officers went for piping around their jackets, but don't fall for the trap that all of them in Sturm Artillery are following the Panzerwolf, which has that pink going around it. They don't. They quite often, very rarely, have piping on Sturm Artillery compared to the Panzerwolf. And I wish I brought the book out, because there's a cracking book on Panzer uniforms that was done quite a few years ago, and he's very clear on that with lots of evidential examples. In other words, surviving jackets and photographic evidence of the time. So don't get too het up about Sturm Artillery in the Sturmgeschützes. Don't tend to go for piping. One or two do, but they tend to be privately purchased jackets. Paul Wilson, his son bought him a few books from our shop for Father's Day. Perspicacious boy you must have there. What a sensible lad for doing such a thing. But your dad was really pleased, Paul. You didn't say your son's name, but well done to son there for buying those books. Zephyr asked the question, did the side skirts on a StuG make the tank heavier, and what were the drawbacks? I think weight-wise, don't forget Hitler all the time, when he's commented on, when they've said put the 7.5 gun, put a howitzer on the Sturmgeschütz, people say, look, it's going to slow it down, it's going to make it front heavy, it's going to have problems with the torsion bar suspensions, etc. Hitler says, look, that's not going to be a problem with these vehicles because of the nature of the either defensive worth or infantry support. Speed is not the essence or something here. So if they come a bit slower, so that idea of the extra weight of that metal on the sides, yes, it is there. I was trying to look it up. I can't find an actual weight for the whole of the adding those extra side skirt sheets overall, but I don't think it's going to be that much. What it does do, of course, is it makes the vehicle that much wider, and that means that often you'll see pictures of them, sometimes with a side skirt ripped off, sometimes it's snagged on things, not just, as it's going down a narrow a gap between trees or something or other, sometimes again as it's pitching forward over rougher ground. So two different ways of affixing those side skirts that change in the war. They try to make them more flexible so they don't get ripped off all the time, but that's one of the biggest problems I can see about those side skirts being put on. And the original intention, Hitler says he wants all his tanks to have that additional spaced armour. The idea behind it was to stop and to tumble anti-tank rifle shots. It's not about hollow charge, although it has an effect later with hollow charge. The early days it's mainly about those Russian anti-tank rifles. If you can tumble the round, it's not going to necessarily have its usual impact onto the metal and therefore maybe not penetrate. And that was the idea of putting all that spaced armour. And it's Hitler who's really insisting it to go on pretty much any German vehicle that could take it, any armoured vehicle that could take it. Gus Walsh asks, was the Luftwaffe the only air force to have a tank arm? Why does the Luftwaffe? Why have we got the Hermann Göring division with tanks fighting in Italy, etc., and various other places? It's because when the Luftwaffe has a surplus of men, Hitler is determined that they should be fighting as infantry. Göring is reluctant to see the release of, and it's a power struggle thing, like we know in the Nazi regime, power struggles beforehand, hence paratroopers are part of the Luftwaffe. So that idea, he doesn't want to hand them over, so he actually forms in essence his own infantry from the Luftwaffe, and they get equipped with tanks and everything. But the idea and the principle behind of air forces, you only have to think about it, go back to World War I, Royal Naval Air Service so it's the Navy's flyers, because we didn't have a Royal Flying Corps or an RAF then. Navy's flyers are the first ones to start patrolling with Rolls-Royce armoured cars. Then in 1921 out in Egypt for fighting in Iraq, the first Royal Air Force armoured car company gets going, and then they make a second and a third one using armoured cars. There is the issue, so again, different forces, because of where they are, there's the issue, why do they need these things sometimes? Well, sometimes it's where they're fighting, we're using aeroplanes, but we need to defend our airfields, and we need to pick up down pilots, and then it becomes a range of things. So why don't they have, in essence, I think the current RAF regiment, which is formed in the Second World War, I think it's 42 RAF regiment was formed. That is in essence soldiers for the Air Force, and that's the way they do it, even though they are part of the RAF. And they also nowadays not just look after airfield defence, they used to look after some of the anti-aircraft roles as well, with anti-aircraft batteries. They nowadays have things like rescue crews, they have spotters that go with special forces. There's a number of roles that come out of the RAF regiment now, as well as its primary one of making sure your airfields are defended. And in World War II, it's when we were going forward to capture airfields as well. Let's stop them cratering an airfield, because that's a brilliant asset as real estate, so that if we've got an airfield we can use fairly quickly. So, you know, this idea, why would they, so the RAF regiment, it uses Humbers, it uses Beaverettes, it uses a number of armoured vehicles. Again, Americans in Vietnam, I thought I can always never remember, it's US Air Force Security. They're the ones, they end up using M113s out in Vietnam, so they're using armoured vehicles. RAF regiment, and back in the 80s and 90s, Scorpions, Scimitars, so little light tanks are being used by them as well as part of their roles. So, and also again, there's areas, so we think of Northwest Europe, but you think out in Burma, where, you know, there's no real front line most of the time. So that idea of defending a landing zone or whatever, again, the RAF regiment out there are really in the thick of it, with a real need for, you know, soldiers in essence to defend as well as the aircraft. And when I was reading about this one of the other things, Churchill is quite adamant. He writes quite a stinging rebuke to the RAF in about 1941, saying, look, there's 500,000 men there. I want them to be trained to defend those airfields if there's a landing, not expect local soldiers to turn up. And actually the RAF also hands over a lot of soldiers a lot of airmen in 44 to become soldiers, because there's a surplus of of RAF personnel, not just aircrew, but RAF personnel in general is considered. And a lot of them move over because we're losing men in Normandy, so they reinforce the infantry that way. I think I got about, here we are, it's 25,000 men actually moved from the RAF and across to the army. So no, basically the Luftwaffe wasn't the only ones to use tanks, and it's one of those peculiar things that goes on, but very different reasons. Politically, it was Goering basically trying to keep as much power in his domain as he could in that period before the war and during World War II as well. Herb Bodman asked the question, where do you go to? Are we going to have support vehicles, etc.? The British Museum, I've got a couple of kind of museum-y type questions coming up. British Museum sector under the Army, so we have the National Army Museum that's based in London, in Chelsea, doesn't have much room for vehicles there, does have some other vehicles, but they're not regularly publicly accessible in a store. But the Army funds a series of core museums, CORPS, so REME, Royal Engineers, Royal Artillery. There's other museums, as well as a series of regimental museums, all of which are worth, if you get the opportunity, go to the Ogleby Trust website. It tells you where all the museums are, as does one of the MOD websites. So if you're coming to Britain or you want to go around and look at different types of military history, there is a great plethora. And then of course there's things like the National Army Museum, but the Imperial War Museum, that's separate from the Army museums but covers 20th century conflicts into 21st century now in a much broader way, does have vehicles up at Duxford at its outstations. So there's another strand with the Imperial War Museum funded museums and outstation. They're all really under their wing, as it were, Duxford, HMS Belfast, etc. And the one that's up in Manchester. What else can I tell you about those ones? So why we don't collect all those others is, number one, we don't have the room, but it's also our remit. You could argue, yes, we should have everything that goes with tank transporters, support stuff, REME vehicles, recovery, etc. Really, that's why the cake is cut. We are one of the few museums, though, that has, because we've got big sexy objects like tanks, we tend to have a good visitor numbers, and that means that we've been able to invest and build space, etc. So we can do it fairly comprehensively Not all those other museums can do it in quite that same manner, but they have great collections. So Royal Logistics Corps, if you want to see a duck, a 3-tonner, etc., those are the sorts of places you want to see as well. So look at those lists, look at how the cake's carved. We'd love to have more stuff here, but the truth is I think it helps concentrate the mind, so you don't just disappear off into every, piece of military history and hardware. I still get miffed, remember what's above the door? We're the Tank Museum. We still get people coming in saying, why haven't you got a Spitfire? So that's where everyone's got different remits and different aims, sexy though it might be to see them all together sometimes. Actually, we're about tanks. We do have some support vehicles. We've got an engineer, we've got a bridge layer, we've got 1 or 2 other things around the edges, but we try and keep to that fighting arm part of the Royal Armoured Corps rather than all the other support services as well. John Tasker, I think it is, asks, how do you find out about someone in the family who might have seen service in the Royal Armoured Corps? I wish I could find it. I've just been looking. We did at the Tank Museum a lovely little book called Tracing Your Tank Ancestors. It is still on Amazon. We've run out in the shop. I think you'll have to get it second-hand on Amazon, but there are copies there. It's not very expensive. The gist is, if there's plenty of good websites now telling you how to research family history, if it's British military history you're interested in, or you've got a person there. It takes you to a number of free websites, so the National Archive, First World War. Second World War is slightly different because people are still alive. You have to prove you're a family member or next of kin to get from Glasgow, and again on the MOD, the British MOD website, there's a list there about service records. They will give you a copy of that person's record, but you can't just get it, just anyone can't ask for it. It's got to be a family member or next to kin. Because of course people are still alive and this is GDPR and all these other rules and regulations going on. And not everyone wants all their private information delved out there yet. First World War, what was left of it, because some of those First World War records were bombed in the Second World War. Those ones have been put online free for National Archive. And once you've got the service record, that's where you then need to come to places like the Tank Museum, if it's Royal Armoured Corps, because then we can then say, look, he was here, so here's the war diary. Might he get mentioned? Some war diaries, really thick, lots of names mentioned. Other war diaries, hardly you ever get a personality. It's all just about the actions and events and dates and times. Names tend to get missed. But at least you can then start working out what are those volumes you need to read, what was it like for him, where was he at what times, because those will be in that paperwork you can get from Glasgow. But do try and get hold of, if you're interested in Royal Armoured Corps, get hold of that Tracing Your Tank Ancestor book, written David Fletcher and Janice Tate, who used to be our librarian, so that's worth picking up there, and all those other little avenues. But nowadays in the digital age, really good news, there's great help for doing that sort of research, and much easier to do than it used to be. Murray Scott, yes, I missed it. It was Canada Day the other week, so hello to all our colonials out there, and I can't say it in French, to the French colonials out in Canada. Andrew Brandenburg asks the question, where's that ball gone? He doesn't ask the question, where's the ball gone? Finn's doing that one. Andrew Brandenburg asks the question, how do you become a curator? And someone, just Ian, came back quickly and said, luck more than qualification. Well, luck, because there's more jobs than there are people who are qualified. I might say that's a bit cheeky, just Ian, but actually in a funny sort of way, you're right. And it's being right place, right time always helps, of course. How do you become a curator? I teach on a course, or one course that's not going anymore, and things, and I often get students as well. They email and say, can you take us through, or how did you get to where, and what's the progression for curators and things. My line on this one is there are not many curators in British museums as there used to be. As a title, that expectation of curator, you're supposed to have sort of subject interest but know how to look after things. And for me, I did a degree, history of art, then I did an MA in curatorship at Manchester University, and that teaches you how to look after things, what the basics are within a museum as a general subject, that you can tend to transfer those skills, different subject matters. And most museums need a qualified person with that qualification to do with their accreditation. In other words, showing they are a pucker museum that knows what they're doing. Because the interesting thing about museums is they do such a plethora of jobs because they have to. So it's everything from running a shop and being a good business to customer service issues, to running quite often food outlets, cafes, to running guides, i.e. people to take you around, wardens, whatever you want to call it, security elements. Or there's such a range of activities that go on. You might have an archive and library, so you need archivists and librarians, depending on the scale you are. We have lots of volunteers that need managing as well. But somewhere there ought to be somebody that says, no, this is the correct way you do it. If you can afford conservators, are they trained conservators? Are they people we call conservators, like engineers, etc.? But they've had enough training to understand the issues. So gradations across a spectrum there. You're going to drop that ball, Finn. And one of the things that I also say to people as well, if you think you're interested in working in a museum, try and have a go at voluntary work, because it gives you a chance to see what's going on in the museum, and you thought you wanted to do this job. Actually, it might be when you see how that organisation works, you might realise it's a different job. And I have to say, museums is another area where, even though the job titles sound similar, the variety within the museum sector, from places such as a fine art gallery through to a heritage site that still may have accreditation, it's running its collections properly, etc. You know, that spectrum is so enormous. You know, what you end up doing under that job title can be very, very different in different organisations. So when I did my work placement at Birmingham City Art Gallery, I always remember the first time, you know, there was about 2 people watching me when I, white gloves handling a glass bowl on a shelf type thing, to other organisations where, frankly, anyone with a bit of common sense is going to help that organisation along, because their resources are so limited. So all the different ways that's going to work. How do you get to being a curator? So you might want to do that qualifications route. One of the other things I say to people, because it's very rare you see, you know, do you expect the curator to have expertise in his area, or do you expect them to know how to look after things? The truth is, there are huge numbers out there of experts in subject areas, and most museums rely on people out there as experts to help them either sometimes catalogue, identify, show knowledge in areas. Every museum can't keep an expert in every area it's supposed to be looking after. You're lucky if you can afford one curator, as it were, that's supposed to have a bit of expertise type thing. So there's that expertise out there, but there's also that side, like I said, of knowing how to look after a collection. What I think as well, a lot of curators, so you might move from pillar to post in collection types. I think it really helps as a curator to have an enthusiasm for what you're looking after, because if you are also influential on the exhibition side, which you'd like to think most museums go to their curatorial side to say, you know, what have we got? Why is it significant? What's its importance there? That influences what goes on displays and themes and topics. It would be a real shame, isn't it, if you're doing that in an area you're not interested in. But I often say to young graduates, that path to get to the subject specialism that you might be interested in may be a very zigzagged one, including doing other jobs other than curator. Because so often I think, and back to the luck bit, if your face fits within an organisation, quite often in museums, people leap across disciplines and areas and finding themselves good at this type of interpretation, or finding themselves actually that was not for them, or they started in a different area. So look at that, think about that one through, because basically the chances of, you know, whatever your interest is of being, I want to be a curator in this subject area, just remember the chance of, number one, a job coming up in that subject area is probably fairly thin. You might have to wait a while to get a bit under your belt before you can go for that job, and lots of other people may be going for that job. So what's proving that you've got that edge, you've got more to offer? Do you have an enthusiasm that you can say? Because I also think as well, you can be very knowledgeable on a subject, you can know how to look after a subject, but if you've got no interest in sharing that with people or communicating your enthusiasm and everything, why is that organisation going to employ you? You know, that's another one of those things. You know, you really want to share it, And I'm never sure about this, that old myth, you know, the curators in their ivory tower, you know, just researching stuff for their own benefit. I very much doubt there's anyone out there doing that these days, and I'm not sure there even was in the past. But you know, if it's going to be for public benefit, if you're taking public money, that's got to show a reward back to the public sometime, not just because someone's got an interest in an area. Lovely though that is, because it's one of those things that helps you explore things. So that's my kind of philosophy, as it were, behind curating. So I would say never give up on the idea of doing it. Show enthusiasm, try for that. When I'm looking at CVs, if we're employing people, I always think, you know, okay, they've had to earn money, they've worked in a bank, but they've made that effort to do a bit of voluntary work, to keep their hand in, to see that to show they've got that interest in that area. Watch it as well. If you really think you want to be a specialist curator or something, careful you don't just end up getting one of those very general heritage degrees that help you. You know, there's all sorts of things from estate management to heritage attraction. There's all sorts of other ways on a spectrum, and not all of them are really going to help you get the type of job you might want. They may be a door opener, in which case, as I say, that gets you through the door. And also I'd say do exactly, ask questions if you're interested in the area, talk to people, how did you get to where, what was your path, you know, because I think you'll then find there's lots of different ways people enter the museum profession and sometimes get to where they want to get to. But, you know, I come back to just being knowledgeable. That really helps if it's a subject you're in. Knowing about a topic is really important, but don't think that's the only thing that any organisation is going to pay a curator for. They want you to be able to do things with that knowledge, and as well as I say, that traditional curatorial role as well is you know, whether it's curating a collection, it's knowing about it in a way, but how you're looking after it, trimming it, pruning it, expanding it, caring for it, all those issues, significance as well, comes under that. So there we go, that's another one there for you. Mark Elliott asked a question, you know, I'm sorry, it's very windy today, so I hope you're hearing all this. Mark Elliott, how many T-34s? He's cited a couple of the books that we produce giving different figures. You're right, pointing that out. It is annoying, isn't it, with that? So I think this is a fairly good waiting to be challenged. You know, there's other figures come out every now and again. With Soviet armour, of course, there was East-West Cold War, lots of subterfuge, never anyone admitting the type things. When the wall came down, I think it got looser. I hate to say, I think it's got a little bit more tenser again in terms of historical knowledge and, you know, finding things out. But anyway, T-34 76s, 34,780. T-34 85s, 22,609. And post-war in the Soviet Union, another 2,701 T-34s, 85s were made. Add on to that, in Poland, when they start making T-34s, 1,380. The Czechs make 3,185, which I reckon, and this is quoting other people here, about 84,070 T-34, 76s and 85s and the post-war ones all told. And on top of that, there's about 13,170 T-34 variants, like SP guns, etc., built on T-34 chassis, on top of that original figure. So that's an awful lot of them. Okay, so I hope that, because sometimes people say, you know, in the war, 34, 50,000, whatever, they're adding up those earlier figures, sort of, you know, 0 and 01 sort of thing. Right, let's have a look. Is this time for me to sell you something else? So I will sell you something else. Those of you I mentioned, because at the weekend, when we did Tank Fest the weekend before, which is, by the way, if you didn't see it, it's there on YouTube if you want to watch it and go through it. It was our kind of Tank Fest online. Thank you, dog, for putting the ball on my trousers. Why am I saying that? Because again, someone said something about top trumps. There we are, World War II tanks. We've got top trumps, Tank Museum tanks, and top trumps. We've even got a World of Tanks. So if you're a World of Tanks player, top trumps for those ones as well. Someone also asked the question, we've purposely done them So, you know, your car stickers, these are now for motorcycles, etc. So they're weatherproof and you can put it on the outside there, or your car, or wherever you fancy putting them, of course. There's your Tank Museum sticker. My other car is a Tiger Tank, so if you fancy one of those ones, and our kind of advertising one that way, but they are so cheap you might as well put one of those if you're putting an order in. And of course, I bring to your attention again, if you're sitting there with your want to engage all the family, you can have Cluedo, Who Murders the Curator, I believe is the game. I didn't approve of this at all, of course, but there we are. There's Tank Museum Cluedo you can buy as a nice board game for you, and that's going to blow over. Let me get back to asking you another question. Another sucker asks, APC armour, why does armoured personnel carriers less armour on? Not always true. Think of the Israelis, they convert some armoured vehicles to make even heavier armoured APCs. Merkava, tank, but it has that capacity for having soldiers in the back where they really need that. There's levels of protection. General theory, it was the Cold War bit of trying to have the way you were using APCs tended to be with speed. So BMP-1 on the Soviets, infantry coming forward, some form of protection from the tanks, deposited, and then the vehicles pull back, slight overwatch, use their weaponry if they can. Same as 432s, it was a battle taxi for dropping soldiers off, didn't intend to hang around in the fighting fire zone for that long, hence less armour protection. Warrior, more armour protection, but still its main protection was speed. Up it goes, drops off and then backs off as quickly as it can. So with a number of these ones, yes, I understand the point. You'd have thought you needed more armour protection. They add more armour protection all the time, but most of the generation of APCs that are still around are those ones that were made for those Cold War type engagements where they thought that picking up and dropping off infantry quickly was the key, and you wanted a light, speedy vehicle rather than a heavily defended one because you were popping in, dropping and backing off quick. That was the idea. George, is it Ruiz, asked, did when we Otto Carriers came to the museum, when I was talking about him there some years ago, did we film him? No, that was before us filming everything, so I'm afraid to say. I was lucky enough just to have a camera, so I took a few pictures, but I had great pleasure walking around, talking to him. And again, I'll tell you another little thing. We had a display of some Nazi memorabilia. He'd bought, by the way, his Knight's Cross with him, and there was some Nazi memorabilia in one of the cases, and he was the one, Otto Carriers, German Tiger commander, who said this business about how many tanks were knocked out. He said, I was a good tank commander if I had a good gunner. This business, he said the line, he said, I think if you added up all these tanks, the aces were supposed to knock out probably more than the Soviets ever built, he said. So he was very cynical about this idea of making tank aces, and maybe some of those tank aces were pretty cynical about it as well, because it was all about the propaganda element. The British Army didn't go for that in the same way, actually. So some pilots were made a little bit more fuss of, but they realised the downside is when you lose that pilot, you know, how does that react if you try to big up names and figures? And it was very different in the British, certainly in the PR element there, compared to where certain key tank commanders were definitely picked on, and the propaganda companies make much of them. But as I said, Otto Carriers didn't think much of that, and he didn't think much of that idea. It was up to the commander. He thought it was up to you having a good gun and made you a great commander. But no, sadly, we didn't video him. The Kilroy man asked the Carnarvon test rig, FE200, where they tested the gas turbine. He said, what happened to it? I gathered it was scrapped. He said, yeah, it is scrapped. What happens is that vehicle, the hull of it later was converted and used as a dynamometer for testing the pull and the strength of a pull of a vehicle and winches, etc. And that was used for quite a number of years. It was then converted to being a watch tower, and we used that at the Tank Museum. We put another layer on it many moons ago. Some of you may remember. The hull was empty by then, and that was used as a commentary base. And then years later after that, it sat looking rather forlorn in our yard, in our graveyard. Ultimately, that vehicle was scrapped. And horror of horrors, I can see some of you screaming at that one, oh, but it had the first ever gas turbine in it. So this is another one of those things. We cannot save every prototype, every first, every what's out there. But what we're now looking at, because frankly, you just have sheds and sheds of this vehicle had that gun fitted for the first time, or this had the following, all those issues that go with that. So what we've decided on there was an example, and it was before our time actually, the gas turbine is what is important about that vehicle's story, having the gas. So we've got the gas turbine. We don't, the Parsons gas turbine, that was the first one fitted in a tank, etc. We don't actually have the hull that was fitted to, because that is, again, like a lot of these problems we've got, is some of these test vehicles are test beds and they go through a number of iterations. So we've tried the gas turbine, boom, we're going to now use that hull for something else. Boom, we're going to now use it for something else during its course of its life. So when you're saying, you know, oh, it was the one that had the first engine in, it also had other iterations as well. But sheer space issues, when we were going through our scrapyard at one point, was what are we going to do? How are we going to get rid of? So that particular one we ended up being scrapped some years ago. Part of, as I mentioned earlier, part of that role, we have a committee, we decide on these things, not just the curator's decision, but that pruning of a collection to keep it healthy, because the honest truth is we could have kept everything over time. It would all be sitting out there in pools of rust, because unless you can look after it, you know, what's the point? And there is back to capacity. Everyone's saying, oh, you know, I would have had it. Would you add a rusty tank like that? You know, so that idea about where else do these things go? And I caution as well, because sometimes we get phone calls, oh, I've just seen a rusty Chieftain, you know, it was the one with the wing nut facing left instead of right. It's on the range, it's being shot up. You guys should save it, shouldn't you? Again, you know, go and get the wing nut if that's the important bit. But, you know, we're not saving a whole nother tank. I can't remember the figure we came out with. We worked out just a concrete floor and the bog standard roof above for a tank size item. Every time you're looking 30, 40,000 pounds, I think it is. And that was some years ago. So remember that every time. And what are we saving it for? What's its significance? I come back to what's that role? Significance is going to change. We're always going to make decisions that maybe later we regret, but just bear that one in mind, because everything can't be saved. Nick Baxter, quite appropriately. Finn says hello to Marnie, by the way. Someone else's dog. And what a sensible wife you've got there, Nick Baxter. Hairy Feet asked a question about the use of captured tanks. What was the issues there? He's mentioned the fact Germans pretty much use everything, put it back into service. Russians use a fair number of tanks. They sometimes regun them or put a new structure on the top. Tends to be Britain and America, Western allies, we don't. We have a few exceptions. There's Cuckoo, the Panther. What was the other one? There was another Panther, I think it was. You know, the Americans had a couple of odd things. They have runarounds. They put, you know, stars on the side. We do soft skin stuff. I think the main reason was, number one, we weren't as desperate as some of the other countries for armour at the time. Number two, the risk factor was still so great, because it wasn't a common thing to be doing. If it's a Panther-shaped object, wherever it happens to be, you're likely to get, you know, RAF or US Air Force have a go at it. And on the battlefield as well, are you sure your own side's going to be recognising that all the time? Because it will be an anomaly, only rarely done. So I think that certainly the British and the Americans, you know, they are dead against it. They're saying to people, no, don't risk this one. So we don't like the idea. Right, Sarah McDowell asks, what's our relationship with some of the American armoured museums? Some of them we know very well. Some, I'll be entirely honest, it's down to individuals' visits. I can't see the ball, I've lost the ball. Finn, oh, there it is, right. Finn, drop it. Okay, he won't. So some, like, we are very much aware of what's going on at Fort Benning. The curator there, some of the staff there have come over for Tank Fest. They've come to our tank net. Some of the other museums, like private ones or semi-private, like up in Seattle, Flying Heritage Collection, I've been out there, and, you know, their guys have come here. So, you know, people do exchange, talking, visits, that type of thing. But in terms of formal relationship, it tends to be with the nationals at TankNet. Otherwise, it's most museums are very good. They tend to exchange ideas for free, and you know, very welcome to come and pick each other's brains. But I'm not quite sure if that answers your question about our relationship with American museums. but we tend to be in terms of formal levels, you tend to go to the national ones first. But of course, there's, like in Britain, lots of other types of collections that always want to come along and have a chat and say hello and do things. So that's, I think, answered that one on that bit there. What else? Now, I've yapped away yet again. I have the excuse at the end of the afternoon because even though actually, be careful actually here, I've got to pop back in. I was allowed, I've got to say this bit now, even though the sun's not out. Perfect time of day, of course, for having your Centurion cider. So I'm going to try this for the first time, like many things, out of my only £2.99 Centurion glass, which you're, why does it always do these things? Which you're going to want to purchase as well, no doubt. And it brings me on, of course, to other things you can purchase. Right. Chin chin. I'll have a little slurp from the throat, of course, like I said last time, purely medicinal. North end of the orchard. That is good, actually. I'm sorry. That's. I will. I'm going to finish that in a moment. I will come back to a couple of other things. So things I was talking about last time. Some of the other books we've got in. Tank Manual, Normandy 44. This is reprints of a lot of that material that went into things like the Churchill book, various other bits and pieces there. So another one of those ones, if you like the idea of reading what the guys had at the time literature, that's a whole series of bits and pieces there, everything from using your 2-inch bomb thrower. So that's a nice little one there in terms of reprints, because I mentioned before, didn't I, if you want to see what, we've still got some of those ones, those Saracen manuals, that's the original publication, again for a vehicle, showing you the whole vehicle, how the user handbook, done in 1976, and again £4.99 for that one. So that, again, if you like your vehicle stuff. Panhard, we've got that now at £8.99, so we've been able to get a stock of those. Again, looking at other countries, how they put together their vehicle history, which again, and I keep going on about these Haynes ones, thank you so much, people coming back saying really well put together books. And yeah, Simon, he's so rude sometimes. I will get, he's going to have a talk about his thing. You see, this is the trouble with stardom. You just got to watch it, what you're talking about when you're talking about dogs. The next minute he's going to want little things on his pillow, I'm saying. But anyway, Simon Dunstan wrote that one, so Panhard on that series. An interesting one that I'm going to read as well, Darkest Days. I'm always of the opinion, and I think I've said it before when I do the First World War, I'm of the opinion that Britain entered the First World War because it had to. This author, Douglas Newton, is arguing, hang on, there was more to this. He's not of the opinion that Britain did the right thing, etc. So an interesting, good reviews, £4.99, how Britain entered the war and what were some of the issues behind it. So I'm going to try and give that one a go in due course. And an absolute classic we've got there again, £4.99, Albert Speer, Inside the Third Reich. I strongly recommend, again, if you want that Speer's account, really interesting. And I would balance that at some point as well by reading Gita Serini, Albert Speer, His Battle with the Truth, which is one of the best books I've ever read in my entire life, which is just staggeringly good. And Gita Serini's books, you know, in general, when she's talked to one of the camp commanders and did a book on that, Albert Speer, she did a series of interviews with him, you know, where he's arguing he didn't know about certain things, and just that first-hand account from someone who, as he says himself, he was enamoured of Hitler, was pushed forward, and back to our subject, you know, is a guy that then rearranges the German, reinvigorates the German arms industry to the point that they are, you know, like we often say, you know, 45, there's more aeroplanes coming out than there are pilots to fly them. So that's from some of the cheaper ones there on the book. One of the other crackers that we've got, £2.99. If you haven't read it, I've read it, The Railwaymen by Eric Lomax, which is a signaller who's out in the Far East, and it's his experience at the hands of the Japanese, and the fact he goes back and meets his one of the people that tortured him after the war, and that sense of trying to find some sort of I don't know what the word you'd say, because it's not. He's not out for retribution. He says, one of his last lines, at some point the hate has got to end. But it is just such a stunning story and such a moving and grueling. Last Highlander, I think it is another one of those great ones where, again, those stories where you think, do I want to put myself through this? It is so worth it. But the fact he goes out there and it's not really resolution, I'm not even sure the right word there, but the fact that he feels he can talk to people who he was one of his torturers afterwards. So, and again, of course, they made it into a film as well, and we actually have that. I've never seen the film yet. I've got it, so we've got it on DVD and Blu-ray if you fancy the film version as well. But I'd recommend that as a book. It's a cracker one, that one, as I've mentioned before. Don't forget our shells. So we've got the 88 there next to the 17 pound. I haven't blown it up, but we also do the 75 armour piercing for the Sherman. So if you want your setup there, and I know a lot of you have been having a lot of fun with your shells. I forgot my outline man that you all commented on, but there's one of our t-shirts, best job I ever had. That's one of the ones we have for sale at the moment with our Fury Sherman on, with of course the line from the film. And I know what you've been waiting for. So here we have Finn's. This is actually a puppet, and Finn's sitting down there watching it because he's still not 100% certain about having a puppet. I've put it on a shell case at the moment to keep it there, and you can have it with your Tank Museum dog tag or without. So you can put your hand up its backside and sit there, talk to it, as we're all doing weird things these days, aren't we? So at least you've got something to talk to, and put it on the sofa next to you when you're watching tank chats and doing all these other things. So if you fancy one of those, we now have them in the shop, and get your own Finn toy so you can play with Finn and have a chat that way. So Finn, who I hope you have been able to see every now and again, because I know he brings a lot of people a lot of pleasure. He brings me a lot of pleasure, but as I said, I'm just getting through that little moment now where I've just got to be careful he doesn't become too conscious of his stardom. Anyway, but thank you as ever if you've lasted this long, answered a few questions. We'll try and keep these going a bit longer. As I say, I know a lot of you are saying, what's going to happen when we go back and working everything. This is working really well for the Tank Museum in sense of buying stuff, keeping an income going. So let's see how things go. Let's see what reopening does for us, because we're still going to have to be able to doing that with limited numbers. So as ever, your support is really important to us. So stay safe. Thank you very much, and keep sending in the questions. Thank you. Oh, a bit more cider. Bit of cider, Finn. Oh, that's good. In these difficult times, obviously your support is really valued. So please do keep following us on social media, do subscribe to our channel, and if you've got the opportunity, perhaps order something from our shop, join one of our schemes like Patreon or our Friends organisation, and we'll try and keep going with giving you some content to keep you informed and entertained.